It was the kind of house that made you stop and stare, not because it was beautiful or grand, but because it felt alive. The old Victorian mansion stood at the edge of town, its peeling paint and broken windows giving it a sinister aura. The locals called it the breathing house, though no one could remember why. Some said it was just an old legend, a story to scare kids away from trespassing. But for Emily, it was about to become a terrifying reality. Emily had just moved to the small town of Black Hollow after inheriting the house from her late aunt, a woman she barely knew. Her aunt had lived alone in the house for decades, and when she passed, the property was left to Emily, the only living relative. At first, Emily was excited. The house was massive, and she could finally escape the chaos of city life. But as she stood in front of the creaking gate, she felt a chill run down her spine. The house loomed before her, its dark windows like empty eyes, watching her every move. The wind whistled through the trees, and for a moment, Emily swore she heard a faint rhythmic sound, like breathing. She shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination, and pushed open the gate. The inside of the house was just as eerie as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. Emily set her bags down in the foyer and began exploring. The house was filled with antique furniture, old portraits, and strange trinkets that seemed to follow her with their gaze. As she climbed the stairs to the second floor, the floorboards groaned beneath her feet, and the breathing sound returned louder this time. Emily froze. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no response, but the sound continued, deep, steady breaths that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She told herself it was just the wind, but deep down she knew it wasn't. That night, Emily tried to sleep in the master bedroom, but the breathing kept her awake. It was everywhere, in the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. She buried her head under the pillow, but the sound only grew louder, more insistent. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a flashlight and began searching the house, determined to find the source of the noise. The breathing led her to the basement. The door was old and warped, its handle rusted shut. Emily hesitated, but the sound was coming from behind the door, and she had to know what it was. She grabbed a crowbar from the tool closet and pried the door open. The hinges screamed in protest, and a rush of cold air hit her face as the door swung open. The basement was dark and damp, the walls lined with shelves filled with jars of strange, unidentifiable objects. The breathing was louder here, echoing through the room. Emily's flashlight flickered as she descended the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. At the bottom, she found a large, ornate mirror covered in a dusty sheet. The breathing seemed to be coming from behind it. With trembling hands, Emily pulled the sheet away. The mirror was ancient, its frame carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move in the dim light. But what caught her attention was the reflection. Instead of her own face, she saw a dark, shadowy figure standing behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone, but the breathing had stopped. Relieved, Emily returned to her room and tried to sleep. But as soon as she closed her eyes, the breathing started again, louder and more frantic than before. This time, it was accompanied by whispers, voices she couldn't understand, but that filled her with dread. She covered her ears, but the sounds only grew louder until they were deafening. The next morning, Emily decided to visit the local library to learn more about the house. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, seemed hesitant to talk about it. "That house has a dark history," she said, her voice low. "Your aunt was the only one who could live there. Everyone else who tried, well, they didn't last long." Emily pressed for more information, and Mrs. Thompson reluctantly told her the story. Decades ago, the house had been owned by a wealthy family who practiced dark rituals. They believed they could summon spirits and trap them within the walls of the house. But something went wrong, and the spirits turned on them. The family disappeared, and the house was left abandoned until Emily's aunt moved in. "She was a strange woman," Mrs. Thompson said. "She claimed the house spoke to her, that it needed her, but no one believed her. They thought she was crazy." Emily returned to the house, more determined than ever to uncover its secrets. She spent hours researching the family and their rituals, piecing together the history of the house. As she delved deeper, she began to notice changes in the house itself. The walls seemed to shift and warp, the breathing growing louder and more erratic. The whispers became clearer, and she could make out words. Her name, over and over again. One night, Emily woke to find the mirror from the basement standing at the foot of her bed. The shadowy figure was back, its form more solid now. It reached out to her, its fingers brushing against the glass. Emily screamed and threw the mirror to the floor, shattering it into pieces. But the breathing didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more desperate. The next morning, Emily decided to leave. She couldn't take it anymore. But as she packed her bags, she heard a voice. A voice that wasn't her own. "You can't leave," it said. "The house needs you." Emily turned to see the shadowy figure standing in the doorway, its form now fully solid. It was her aunt, but not as she had known her. Her eyes were black, her skin pale and translucent. "The house is alive," her aunt said, "and it has chosen you." Emily tried to run, but the doors and windows were sealed shut. The breathing was everywhere now, filling the house, filling her mind. She collapsed to the floor, clutching her head as the whispers grew louder, more insistent.
When the townspeople found her days later, Emily was gone. The house was silent, the breathing and whispers finally still. But as they left, they swore they heard it, a faint rhythmic sound like breathing coming from the walls. The house had chosen its next tenant, and it was only a matter of time before it woke again.